Hi, folks. Welcome on in. Welcome, welcome.
Ooh,
Yeah, it's so fun watching those numbers climb.
I know.
Beautiful. So, my name is Amanda Lee, and I'm going to be the Zoom host for today's event. I am so thrilled to be welcoming everyone to this interview with Anne Weiser Cornell and Barbara McGavin on their new book titled Untangling: How You Can Transform What Is Impossibly Stuck. I am tuning in today from the traditional land of the Chera and Occaneechi people, among many other indigenous tribes. Colonially, this place is known as Greensboro, North Carolina. So, first, Barbara McGavin. She is the co-creator of Inner Relationship Focusing and Untangling. She has a background in humanistic psychology, teaching, fine art, and graphic design. Besides her work with Anne Weiser Cornell, she has developed a focusing-based creativity practice called From Spark to Beacon. She has also created a decision-making process, spectrum decision-making, which seeks to generate consensus through actively valuing conflicting viewpoints. She was one of the she was one of the founders of the British Focusing Network and the British Focusing Teachers Association. She is also an accrediting mentor for the British Focusing Association. And then Anne Weiser Cornell is an author, educator, and worldwide authority on focusing, the emotional self-healing method developed by her close colleague Eugene Genlin. She has taught inner relationship focusing in 20 countries around the world for more than 35 years, as well as online. Her books include The Radical Acceptance of Everything and Focusing in Clinical Practice, The Essence of Change. She is a past president of the Association for Humanistic Psychology. I'd also love to introduce y'all to Jamila, who will be our interviewer today. Jamila is an integrative somatic trauma therapy specialist, a multi-certified energy worker specializing in Kundalini activation, Sat Nam Rasayan, and transcendental meditation. She has sat with Aboriginal energy workers from West African Yoruba culture and traditional Nakari healers. She has trained with Dr. Deb Dana in polyvagal theory and holds certificates for mind-body coaching, integrative somatic trauma therapy, also psychedelics and somatics with Dr. Devin Christie and Atira Tan. All right, so with that, it's my pleasure to hand it on over to Jamila so we can hear from Anne Weiser Cornell and Barbara McGavin.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Amanda. I feel like we're in such great hands today. And thank you, Janelle, for being in the background with any tech issues. And I'm grateful everyone's here today live to
Oh,
engage and
yeah.
ask for questions. We have these two amazing authors. I just have to say, I loved your book so much. I got a lot out of it personally, as I've kind of struggled with some tangles. But seeing
Mm.
as the term is something that a very fun way of addressing it, can we start off with just what is a tangle? What do you each define as a tangle?
Okay. Well, a tangle, you could say, is a situation or a whole group of situations in your life which are actually impossible. Like
Mm.
you want to engage with them, you want to do something, and you just get, ugh, it's like you hit a wall, or you go sideways, or you do all sorts of things, but you can't live forward in that area of your life. And we call them tangles because there are so many aspects that are all wound up in this one place. So and we call, so there's parts which do different things. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to that. But it's basically a situation or a bunch of situations in your life where it's impossible for you to live forward freely.
And if it's a tangle, you've usually tried many things that either haven't worked or have made it worse. And you've even tried giving up on it. And even that hasn't worked because somehow
Yeah.
you never, it doesn't let you give up on it either. I remember when I had writer's block, I want so hard for me to write, and yet the dream of writing was so big. and I wanted to give up. Okay, then I'm
Yeah.
not going to be a writer. Forget about it. It's too much torture. It wouldn't let me give up.
Mm.
So tangles are tough areas of life. They're areas where something's impossible.
Yeah.
I love that. And look at you now. The book is here, incarnate. Okay. No, that's great. It's funny because I never resonated with the term blockages because I felt like a block implies you have to like fight, get it. So I used to call them knots, which I realize is it's very similar to
Another
tangle,
word for tangle.
right?
Yeah.
Because even when you're trying, if you squeeze too hard, it's like it'll tighten as well. So
Yeah. Exactly.
you can give some examples from your book of what a tangle is for the folks here.
Who's going to do it? Go
Well,
ahead.
the writer's block was one.
It's one good. Yeah.
And but we like to tell the story of really how this work gelled for us. We'd been each working in the area of personal growth for many years, and it had helped us. We're using a method called focusing, and we were developing an aspect of focusing that we call inner relationship focusing. It helped us with so many things, but what were the things that were left that felt too shameful to talk about, even to each other? And just if focusing doesn't help with this, then it must really be hopeless. I must really be hopeless. And mine was an addictive use of alcohol that came to a crisis in September 1994, about 30 years ago. And tell us about yours, Barbara.
Yeah. Well, there were a couple, but the kind of the central one was I would keep falling into these depressed pits of depression. And to the point where I really felt like I had to give up. I was going to give up. And it was kind of scary. I had a young child, a little daughter, and she was really in some ways the only reason that I stayed on this planet because I couldn't leave her. But I also felt so awful in my own life. I mean, just dreadful. And it just, even with all of the focusing I was doing, I would have little, moments of sunshine and brightness, and then the gloom would descend again. And it's like, oh my God, am I ever, ever, ever going to get out of this? It was so scary and so painful. And I had to pretend all the time that I was okay. Anne didn't know what was going on for me. So we were close friends. We were in pretty constant communication and
We were
yes,
teaching together, and she didn't know what was going on for me either, partly because each of us felt what we were going through was so shameful.
I had to
We
hide
didn't
it.
want anybody to know.
Anybody to know. And no, I mean, hell, we were professional focusing teachers. We're supposed to have this kind of professional thing
Have it
going
together,
on.
right?
Yeah. And we like so didn't in these areas. I mean, in a lot of areas, our lives were pretty together. I mean, focusing is a great thing. It's wonderful in so many ways, but wasn't getting to this stuff.
Yeah.
And we had to come up with something different. We had to come up with something that was going to actually make a difference in these really messed up areas of our lives.
What I think is important is that everything we teach now in the method called untangling, we found first for ourselves. We didn't even know it would be for anybody else. It was like,
Yeah.
okay, we confessed to each other what was going on, each of us, and we said, okay, let's see what we can do. And together we came up with the methods that were the seeds for what over the next 30 years became what untangling is today.
Yeah.
We led the way, but very quickly people started asking us, what is it you're doing? And asking us questions that we could only answer by coming from our new insights. And that's why a year after we began creating it, we were already teaching workshops in it because people were asking us for that.
I mean, it was a pretty pared down kind of nascent version of it, but it was a start. And from there, it has developed and refined and elaborated. And now we are ready. Now we can do this. Now we can put out this book. It took a long time to get to the point where it stopped moving all the time. I mean, every time we taught, we would learn so much more and have to articulate it in a myriad of different ways. But finally, it's like it's slowed down enough that we can put it
Well,
out. There's
but
still
then by the time the method held still enough that we could write it, we were teaching around the world 5 or 6 times a year internationally. We didn't have the time. So the pandemic came. And in 2020, we
these are
canceled
good things. Yeah.
5 international trips, and we used every
Every time that we had set aside to actually just get on and work on the book.
yeah,
And
and
and it got to the point where we had a book.
that's why it exists.
Yeah.
Such a fun process. It's nice to get a sneak peek into the process of you two working together. I can tell that it was such a beautiful collaboration, and it takes a lot of trust. Um, and a question I had, what you were bringing up, is around, you were saying you both were going through your tangles quietly, silently. And I feel like that is a theme that I've seen
Yeah.
throughout also in my life, experiencing it, that's almost part of what makes something a tangle, is that it is so shameful we don't speak it aloud. Can you speak to the importance of vocalizing or expressing or sharing to detangle?
Hmm.
Well,
That's an interesting question.
once it can be shared,
Mm.
a barrier has been crossed. And
There's,
so it's
yeah,
possible that it's very important to have people in your life who you trust enough to share with. What were you going to say, Barbara?
yeah, there is another side to it, which is that some of the most important shifts that I've ever had in my life, I've had on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are ways that, in the book, we talk about what we call self-in-presence and the cultivating of self-in-presence. And that is so that I can be that companion to myself. And that's the core. That's in some ways the most important thing, is that capacity to be able to hold a space, to be able to acknowledge how it is for me right now, even if I'm not sharing it with somebody else. The first step is I can say, yeah, this is tough, and I am here. So the I am here is the big thing. And I can make a space for whatever it is in me that needs that kind of attention, that kind of focused, you could say, attentive, compassionate, spacious, curious attention. And that, when you can do it with somebody else, yeah, that adds to it, but it's not the essence. It's not what's essential, which is like, wow, that means I'm really free to be able to do this even at 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't have to wait for somebody else here. I can make this space for whatever it is in me that needs my attention right now. And that's cool.
As tangles untangle, our interactions with other people become freer and more available.
Yeah.
So sometimes it needs to start in that inner world with my own self acknowledging how it is for me. And then as that releases and loosens, I begin to be able to take a chance to tell somebody else. And then their way of responding and receiving me allows me to add to my ability to be with myself, so that they dance with each other.
Mm.
Right. Yeah.
It's a beautiful way of phrasing it, dance with each other. Very fun. So I know that can you talk about how untangling relates to the body? How is it a somatic practice?
Right. Okay. That has to do with what is a body, for one thing, because the body is not in our world, in Anne's and my world, in the world of focusing, the body is not just what you can touch. the body is actually, we could call it the experiential body or the felt body. And that is, when you have a sense of something behind you, that is within your body. That's inside your felt body. And in our work, it includes what you can touch, what you can feel, your viscera, the whole bit, and this whole experiential body, which can be really, really big. So that is, and our work is sensing in and from the experiential body. Have
And
I said it right? More to say?
I would add to that. Absolutely. That's absolutely right. I would add to that. Untangling is a interrelationship focusing process and draws on the insights that came from the research into successful psychotherapy that our teacher Eugene Gendlin did in the 1950s. And that was that successful psychotherapy clients were sensing inside themselves, in their bodies, and feeling something that they could not articulate very well at first. So they weren't just talking using old concepts and familiar phrases. They were sensing, I don't know how I would say this, but it's right here. So that he called that a felt sense. And felt sensing seems to be a real key to change. It's something you can find in every kind of therapy. It's been brought into Hakomi therapy by Ron Kurtz. It's been brought into somatic experiencing by Peter Levine. They drew it directly from Gendlin's work. And it's at the heart of what we do as well. Felt sensing is a direct experience of something that's emerging right now. And it allows change to happen. That's how change happens. not just by repeating concepts and thinking and having ideas and telling stories. That's important. And we also need, how are you sensing it right now? How does it sit in you right now? And it's a deeply somatic process. In our view, the somatic dimension, in that sense, is at the heart of all change.
It's essential.
Yeah.
To someone that is more cerebral or more used to psychotherapy and less used to their felt sense, what is either an exercise or kind of a cue? How would you kind of guide someone that keeps wanting to talk about it, from a more intellectual perspective back to make sure that they're using their felt sense?
Well, the talking may be important. It may be what the person needs in order to get in touch with what's more than the talking. And at some point, though, perhaps they would pause in the talking. And now that I've been talking, let's pause now. Pausing is like the key. It's the first number one key move. Pause and take a breath, drop down, feel what's here. What's here right now? Maybe people are trying it right now as they're listening. Here I am listening to these people, and I'm living my life today, and maybe I've got something I've got to do right after this, and maybe, how am I right now? What's the feel of it? And there's that moment when you realize, well, it's more than what I was saying. It's more than what I was thinking. Maybe it's just a little shaky feeling or just a little tightness. You think, oh, that's nothing. But it isn't nothing. It's the beginning of something. So that's the first invitation to pause and sense. Yeah.
That's extremely helpful, that idea of getting quiet, that the body, I've experienced that as well, that it's almost been conditioned to be a little quiet. I feel like it was louder when I was a kid, when I was a toddler, I was really in touch. And then you just learn to ignore it. And so it gets quiet, but it's never silent. It's always there. And so I love that invitation to just pause, slow down, and connect. So is this something people can do entirely on their own by themselves, just with your book, go through these processes, or is this recommended that you do a more therapeutic approach with a professional, licensed professional, or both? Or what do you, how does it work?
whatever works.
Yeah, I mean, it can be done, I expect, on your own, like following the book. But it you'd probably get more and go deeper. Um, Possibly through, we run courses. We run courses in focusing and in untangling. And so having that kind of support so that you really have focusing for yourself. I mean, in order to really get the most out of this, having focusing for yourself is really, really important. And we ask that if you come and do our courses in untangling, that you have a grounding, a basis in focusing.
And in focusing and untangling, we actually have a model of focusing partnership,
Right.
where you don't have to be a professional in order to be a focusing partner. It's actually a model of community wellness, where you and a friend who you trust sit across from each other. One person has a half-hour turn or an hour-long turn to go inside, to sense, to describe, to follow the processes we talk about in our book. And the other person is the companion, the listener, holding space, being present. And then you trade, and it goes the other way. And what you learn, go ahead.
One of the things I really love about our work, this work, is that you really get to take responsibility for your own well-being, for your own mental health, for your own inner journey in a way that you don't get to do it in the same way when you're sitting across from somebody who's a professional. I mean, not that I'm
We're in favor of
professionals at all.
professionals. We teach. We're happy to have therapists in our courses, and
Absolutely.
somatic practitioners, and so on. And for a mental health model for the whole world, one-to-one work is also important.
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. So really it does feel like coming from all sides and starting with yourself and then having opportunities to work with both professionals and just community, people who care in the community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very,
That's
it seems like there's a lot of applications, both in, therapy rooms, but then also perhaps even in schools or, right? Where do you see
Wouldn't
bringing
that be great? Schools,
I-
prisons, hospitals, yes, everywhere.
And our work is in schools and prisons and hospitals.
Right.
Mhm.
That's so
Mhm.
exciting. Congratulations. Yeah, I can
Mm.
see how this could be, become a
Not as
way
much as it should be. Yes.
No.
Sorry. Thanks. Yeah.
one
Right.
day.
Yeah. That would be great.
What are
Mhm.
some of the key concepts for the folks here who want to know more about untangling the steps? What are some of the key concepts you would pull out and want to share with us today?
Key concepts, Barbara.
No, go for it.
Well, Barbara's already mentioned our key concept, which is self-in-presence. Self-in-presence. It's a funny word, self-in-presence. And that means the ability to turn toward anything inside you. It's not some kind of entity inside that you have to find self-in-presence somewhere outside and bring it in. No, it's simply when I can turn toward my anger. I can turn toward my worry. I can turn toward that tangle that everything feels impossible in. And I can say, hello, I'm here with you. Barbara mentioned, I am here. It's one of the key phrases. And we use some other language that also helps self-in-presence. I am sensing something in me feels or is or says. So if I'm angry, what if I say, I'm sensing something in me is really angry, and I am here with that? I'm confused.
That creates a space where the part of me that is really angry gets to be absolutely as angry as it is. I don't have to control it. I don't have to suppress it. I don't have to partition it and push it away. But so I can make a big space. Something in me is just absolutely furious right now. And I am here. So I can be curious about what's going on, that something in me feels this way. So I don't have to get caught up with, is it too much? Is it reasonable? Am I going to freak out? Am I going to hurt anybody? Any of that kind of, like, those kinds of worries, they can be there too, but I also don't have to be identified with that. So I can have a space for everything that's going, oh my God, this is not good. And both of those have a space. And that brings us to our second, we have 5 powers, we call them the powers of presence. And the second power is the capacity to make a space for all the different aspects and parts. Because in a tangle, all of those parts are all like twisted up in together and fighting with each other or trying to change each other or whatever. But then we can lay them all out, and there's lots and lots and lots of space. We get very, very big as self-in-presence. You can be vast and have a space for each of these so that each aspect of a tangle gets the attention it needs. And then there's me. And as soon as, like, oh yeah, there's all of this, and I can make a space for all these different aspects, I can breathe again. There is a different kind of breathing that can happen. Okay, there is a lot, and I'm acknowledging there's a whole lot in this. And I'm okay. I'm okay. And I can hold it. I can contain this. I can make space for all of this. And I can be curious. That's such a difference than being all tied up in the middle of this mess and being torn about by it. So those are those 2 concepts, I guess you could call them.
Well, let's say just a little more about that, because
Right,
to
go
me,
for
it's
it.
very important that this process, untangling, is not a process of trying to figure out or fix or solve or push. It's agenda free. Obviously, we want to get untangled, but we understand that the way to do that is not by trying to change anything. So a little bit of a paradox there, but a kind of an amazing one, which is that if I can be the space, the listening, accepting, compassionate space for everything inside me, that creates an environment in which change is possible. Now, there is a third step, but those 2 steps already are key. That if I find I'm anxious, I'm urgent, this has to change, then that becomes another something that I say hello to. So I'm sensing I'm really angry. I'm sensing something in me is really angry. And I'm sensing something in me is terribly worried about that and is afraid it will burst out and ruin my life. And I am here with both. So those are those first 2 steps. And of course, there's the third part and the fourth part where we have all the ands we need. Yeah. But then we get to our third step, which is called deep empathy.
Power. Yeah.
Our third power. She's right.
Yeah.
Third power. Deep empathy means that for each of these different sides or parts, feelings, states, and so on that I've identified, I, self-in-presence, will be the listener. And I'll be deeply empathic to what it would like me, not just what it would like me to know, because at the surface level, parts are so worried and so caught up in their agendas for us that, well, frankly, they might even not tell the truth. But I'm listening respectfully to that surface level, and then also going deeper than that. We have a method that we've developed that is likely to get to the place where every part of you will tell you reveal to you what it most dreads and what it most desires. And then we're on the way,
for your life,
for your whole self, what it wants for all of you. And then we're on the way to real transformation.
Before we go into the 4th and the 5th one, I just want to share that as you were describing the 1st and 2nd one in particular, it seems like there's a large degree of non-judgment that has to take place.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I can
right.
see that being the biggest hindrance
Yeah.
to doing that. And once you can get to a place where you're not judging, and just allowing that inclusion that you mentioned in the second part of not saying that there's nothing that's outside of the tangle, everything can be part of it. It's funny because it reminds me of Satnam Rasayan, which is an energy healing modality that predates the written language.
Uh-huh.
And that's the key concept behind that, is that everything, people heal through energy by accepting everything as it is. And so I just want to point out that we live in an amazing age right now where evidence-based research is catching up. It's like they're coming together with spirituality. And I think I saw in the chat someone even asking, like, is this spiritual? Does this have a spiritual component? Because it does already. As you're speaking, I feel my body responding to it as you two are talking, because you're talking about something very deep about just truly being present with yourself. So have you ever explored that, or what are your thoughts around you know, is there a spiritual or energetic component to what you're doing?
Well, our work is based on the philosophy of Eugene Gendlin. And he taught and wrote and discovered that everything that's alive is interconnected with everything else. And that we, as a living being, have an inner knowing of the right next steps, not only for our own organism, but for the whole. And I believe, by any definition of spirituality, that is one. It's the sense of being part of something larger, and drawing from that. That is spirituality in a non-denominational sense. It also makes so much sense that something this true, you know, that acceptance allows change, has been discovered and has been known for a long, long time. Something about modern society, technology, and so on seems to tend to make us forget all that.
Thank
We
you for
have to do things. We have to make things. We have to make it happen. But it turns out you don't.
I love that. So I think there's four more uh, points that we could draw to.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
What's the next one you want to know about?
So the next one is about, you mentioned, we're talking about parts work. Why is it important to talk about parts when we're dealing with tangles specifically?
Okay. Let's call it functional. It's important to talk about parts because it helps the process, excuse me, of being able to be with something in a way which allows for connection and clarity in some ways. But really, it's about if I turn towards something and it's relate to it in a way like it's a living being, then there is movement that can occur. There are next steps that can unfold. There is a deepening and a way of being able to get to the core of what is stuck. That doesn't happen if I don't. So it's functional in a way, even though we could say that parts are, they're a useful fiction because actually we aren't in parts, but it's useful in this process to talk about parts and to work with parts. That's kind of how I see it.
Say a little
There's
more
some
about
other-
that. Someone, I noticed, I took a peek at the Q&A and somebody wanted to know more about my process of releasing an addictive use of alcohol. That's a great example of what we're talking about. So I came, it turns out to be, my first step was the same as the first step of the 12 steps, which is I realized I was powerless over alcohol. But what would I do then? And I was about to teach with Barbara. So the easiest thing to do, even though it was very hard, was to tell her what was going on and that I was worried. I'd been lying to myself, telling myself my alcohol use wasn't a problem. I was worried that I was going to fall into lying to myself again. And I felt powerless and helpless and worried and anxious. And she said, well, let's try focusing. And the rest is history. But as an example of the functionality of parts, as long as I was saying, I want to drink, and I feel anxious and terrified and worried about it, I was kind of stuck. There wasn't really a place to move from there. But as soon as Barbara suggested maybe you could say there's a part of you that wants to drink, maybe there's something in you that wants to drink, and you could say hello to that, the whole thing loosened. What became possible then was that I could have a relationship with the one that wanted to drink and not be identified with the one that was so worried about trying to control it and eradicate it. I could be with both. And in other words, we talk about parts because it works.
Yeah.
Wow.
But what happens as parts resolve, so to speak, is that they are no longer parts. So all of everything that's been held is in each part. We have found that it's kind of a custodian of an aspect of yourself, an aspect of your energy or your capabilities. And so when a part no longer has to be artsy, so to speak, then whatever is held in there as your abilities and whatever it's learned, whatever it's developed, just becomes free. It becomes free to become who you are again. It's like it sort of melts back into you, something like that, or dissolves back into you. I wouldn't quite call it integrates because that tends to mean that it's still a part, but it's like it's just free. You're free in that way. And we've had that happen over and over and over again.
People have also asked in the Q&A about IFS and voice dialogue and how our kind of parts work distinguishes itself from those. My impression of IFS is that in their view, we're born with parts, we will always have parts. It's that parts take extreme forms under conditions of trauma and the lack of self. So we see it differently from that. In our view, parts come into being in response to an impossible situation in the life. And parts are narrow by their very nature. They're less than the whole self. We can call a part a partial self. So as untangling happens, parts are happy to rejoin the whole. They don't, there's never has to be a conversation about that. It just happens.
Yeah.
And in IFS, I've heard people say, well, give parts a new job or create some good parts who will do this kind of thing you need to have done in your life. And I respect that work. It's helped many, many people, but that's not our view of what parts are. We think they come into being and then they melt, that they're like waves in the ocean. They're not long-lasting or permanent entities.
That's such a beautiful analogy, waves of because it puts it right into perspective. So you kind of already answered this question. I know we've talked about this before, but is there anything else you want to say to define parts in your view, from your lens? What are parts?
Well, one way we've put it is that they are repetitive
reaction sequences.
Yes, reaction sequences.
Yeah.
It.
So they're attempts to solve a problem, but without the resources of the full self. And therefore that attempt has to keep repeating. And therefore the repetition of a process starts to look like something permanent. There's something, oh, that's my pusher, or that's my people pleaser, or that's but it isn't actually something permanent. It's just an attempt to move beyond a stoppage. Yeah.
And it's partially successful. And that's partly why it repeats over and over is because it's partially successful,
Yeah.
but it's not fully successful. It doesn't carry forward you, your whole being, and the situation that you're living in so that the next step can occur. The next step of living can occur. You just wind up repeating the same old steps over and over again in various variations, but you don't actually get to fully live forward that situation.
I really enjoy that note that you just made there, Barbara, about we have to accept that what is working about it. I think that's an
Yeah.
important part. Instead of
Mhm.
vilifying,
Yeah.
be like, how does this
Absolutely.
affect me? You know, how has
Hey,
this affected me? Yeah.
we really honor all our parts. They are, I mean, think about this part of us that criticizes us. I mean, in the face of being hated by the rest of us forever, it still doesn't give up. Its tenacity is extraordinary. And my heart goes out to these poor parts of us, these poor critics that have tried so hard for so long and still haven't given up because they really want to take care of us. We have great regard for critical
Yeah.
parts.
And every tangle is the best that our parts could do to solve a problem.
Yeah. To try to
That's
solve a problem.
yeah, yeah. Well, I
You
noticed
just
that.
think, yeah.
Well, we should probably mention the last two powers since people
Yeah,
are asking
quickly.
about that in the Q&A. So number one, cultivate self-in-presence, the most important of
Yeah.
all. Number two,
And
the power.
every other power is actually an expression and an elaboration of this first power. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. And number
Number
two,
two.
the power of and, which is that I am the space where all of my parts get to be equally valued.
Mm-hmm.
Number three, the power of deep empathy, which means being with each part in the way that it needs to get in touch with its deeper levels of need and desire. Number four has to do with the stoppage. And a stoppage is the impossible, the thing, the interruption of the process that was ready to go forward, and all of a sudden, or over a continuous amount of time, it could not go forward. And that might mean that you were looking for love and to be appreciated and to be given attention, and instead you were left in the crib for 8 hours a day. No, that's a stoppage. So many things we carry with us that get in the way of being fully present to our life right now could be defined as stoppages. And there's a stoppage at the heart of every tangle, even if we don't know what it is. It's not like we have to resurrect what happened in the past. The tangle knows.
Yeah. Even if you never know what it is, it can be resolved.
Yeah. And you do it by, well, number four is, yeah. And number five is about the whole thing, getting a felt sense of the whole tangle and moving forward from the freshly arising sense that comes of the whole thing. So those are our five powers, and they all work together.
Yep.
But really the first three are the key. Most untangling sessions are the first three, and really the first one, cultivating self-in-presence. Well, we're getting up to that time when we wanted to open up to questions, aren't we, Jamila?
That's right.
We are. We have one that actually corresponds with one that you had. That's what we were kind of talking about before as well. Just why do we have tangles and where did they come from?
Yeah.
That's a good one.
When it is impossible, something happens in our lives and we respond to it. There's something difficult, but we can't resolve it. And in our attempt to resolve it, we further fail. And that failure in tangles, it generally has to do with other people and other people not supporting us to be able to engage, to be able to successfully deal with that. But tangles usually have an extra element, and that is that we wind up being punished for our attempts to solve it, or we wind up being punished for our upset about it being difficult. So if we wind up crying about it, like it's hard and we want help, and we're told, go away, you know, stop it. You know, if you cry more, I will really give you something to cry about. That favorite phrase of many different places. Anyway, that tends to create this terrible, you know, you can't fix it and there's pain around it. And then you have to deal with trying to cope with not showing the pain, suppressing the pain. So all the stuff then winds up. So you have this core and then the stuff that winds up wrapping itself about it. That's kind of a shortened version of the origin story of Tangles.
It becomes what we call the frozen core, because freezing is the best way, right? Best, without enough support in the environment, freezing is the best way to deal with something that can't be felt and can't be expressed. But our news is good. And I think many other methods share this good news, which is that it's never too late for healing.
Mm-hmm. It can always thaw. It can always recommence. It can always go forward again.
Never too late.
You bring the right environment to it when you create the right environment for it. And then it'll just do it. It gets the right environment, it does it.
Mm-hmm. It's been waiting for that.
Yep.
So powerful. I'm so grateful for this work and just this terminology, your framework. Everything is very, it really resonates. And I feel like it's resonating with a lot of our guests here. So feel free to raise your digital hand. We want to take some questions live. So if you have a question you'd like to ask live, feel free to raise your digital hand down at the bottom of your screen. You can, it's not under reaction. Oh, there's some people. Brittany's
Hey,
figured it out.
Brittany.
I'm going to go ahead and bring you up, Brittany, and you can ask your question live.
Okay, do you want my video on?
Yeah, it helps us when we can.
That'd be nice. That'd be nice.
Okay. Let's see. I'm outside. Hi.
Okay, great. Hi.
I was not at all expecting to engage today, but yeah, the question I had was, what happens when people struggle to be like really connected to that capital S self or self-in-presence, the part, or you know, the self that needs to engage these parts. Like I've found
what happens
that
when you struggle?
for me that's
Yeah.
well, yeah, I think I've seen this in myself and clients where the parts are so in the forefront that there isn't like an essence self to even show compassion or hold the space. So I'm curious how that's sort of addressed in this work. I'm very fascinated.
Well, a tangle is defined as an area of life where it's hard to be self-in-presence. So when we teach this work, we teach it a lot, and we had to deal with it in ourselves as well. Because in a tangle, the parts are trying to each take over and be yourself so that they can put in their solution that they think will help you. They're all trying to help, but they do it kind of like a drowning swimmer taking over the person who's rescuing them. So again and again, like we have ways of cultivating self-in-presence. We have 3 pillars of self-in-presence: recognizing, resourcing, and relating. And when I'm speaking to a client, I do my best to remember there is a self there. They are that self, even if they are not aware of it right now. So I speak to them from that knowing. Maybe somebody's really in the midst of an emotional storm, caught up in feeling weak or small, downtrodden. And after I'm there for that empathically as myself, I might say to them, and maybe you can be with all that as well. And so the word I use to speak to a client to refer to self-in-presence is the word you. Maybe you can be with that. But I think that one thing people may need therapists for and practitioners is to be self-in-presence for them for a while and
Yeah.
let them, yeah. And that's one of the gifts you have for your clients, is to hold that space for them. At the same time, you have confidence that they have that in them.
And when you're practicing this with yourself, is it important to like first get into self-in-presence before even sitting down to practice?
Well, we mentioned the 3 pillars of self-in-presence. Recognizing is noticing when you're not there. Resourcing is the things you can do in advance in order to get yourself in that state. But relating means that when a part comes, just by the way you relate to it, you're helping yourself get into self-in-presence. So either one, you can start in either place.
Thank you so much. This is so helpful.
Okay, great.
Yes. I see we also have Nicole has their hand up. I'm going to go ahead and bring you on up. Perfect.
Hi, I'm also going for a walk and I have like water in my throat, so don't mind me. But I was just wondering if in their research they found any correlation between tangling and fear of death and insecurity, because I was noticing this distinction between IFS and their work around allowing the parts to dissolve back into the whole self versus in IFS where they're given a new role. And my understanding with IFS is that part of that new role is so that parts don't have that fear of death and being let go of. And I do think that, you know, I find that those parts like in the tangling resulting from our parts doing the best that they can, it's to survive, right? And to thrive, and to be secure. And so, yeah, just wondering if that has come up, and in that process of the dissolving back into the whole self, if there is this need to kind of address that death, even if it's just in like these small ways around certain identities that we hold those parts.
I have found that it only comes up parts saying, I'm scared I'm going to die. I mean, it happens occasionally. But that means that something else has not yet been addressed, that they are holding on to something that still hasn't been known, like that there's something that they are still worried about. And they aren't quite fully trusting that self-in-presence is going to be strong enough to be able to deal with whatever it is that they're concerned about. When their concern gets really fully, deeply, completely heard, and they go, oh, okay, you got it. You really understand what it is. You really understand what it is that I am worried about. They go. And it's usually a particular kind of part. We talk about different kinds of parts. And they disappear. They do it. It's not like we get them to dissolve. They dissolve. They're gone. And then, yeah.
Well, just to really be clear, we don't ever, just to underline what Barbara just said, we don't ever invite or have parts dissolve.
That's right.
We would be happy if they stayed forever. There's no agenda for parts to even change.
Yeah.
They can be as they are. We've noticed that they tend to dissolve, but that's only something we've noticed, not something we're after.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that when we ask what they most deeply desire, they are almost always what they want to have live is us as a whole self.
Yeah.
They're after the life of the organism.
Not themselves.
Like that, there's a kind of part, 80% of parts are this kind of part. They don't even kind of think they have a self. They're always just wanting us to live, for us to be happy, for us to be safe. And when that's understood, and then they start to believe that we're self-in-presence and there's somebody else here worrying about that, they just sort of back up. So
they They're gone.
Yeah.
I used to be beset by inner critics, basically. And it just, I mean, it's so unbelievably infrequent that it even shows up at all anymore in my life. It's like,
Yeah.
whoa, that's really interesting. They're gone.
Very
And
integrated.
I get to be wild and crazy.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for your question, Nicole. We do have two more from the Q&A if we have time to get to both.
Okay.
Costanza and Jackie seem to share the same question, just around does it mean that tangles come from unintegrated traumas? And what's the relationship between trauma and tangles? Are they inherently, I know they could be the same, but they also, how are they different? How are they
Well,
different?
let's just say that the word trauma can be quite vague and used in different ways for different things. I mean, what the quote unquote trauma that was the heart of many of my tangles was my dad being distant, emotionally distant.
Yeah.
And would you call that a trauma? I mean, some would and some wouldn't.
Yeah.
But if you find a tangle and you go to what is impossible at the heart of it, then
You find it.
yeah, and also things that you would consider traumatic don't always end up being traumatic for the person, because the person has the resources in their life at some point for that to resolve. So, as many people have said, including Bessel van der Kolk, trauma is not the thing that happens. Trauma is what happens next,
Afterwards.
the response to it. Yeah.
Very
Mhm.
great response. So Pear has a really amazing question. Curious about the use of voice dialogue as a part of the process in your Tangle work. Is presenting Tangles in an objective point of view begin to allow space for it as a reality that is not identified as me?
Well, if you mean the voice dialogue work of Hal and Sidra Stone, not very familiar with that, but it's, I think, similar to Gestalt, where you give voice to the different parts. Not exactly something we do necessarily, although it could be combined. And I do think there's a kind of space that's allowed when you say this is a tangle, rather than I'm a mess.
Mhm.
It does, in that sense, there's an objectivity to it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think
It
that's right.
frames it in a different way.
Mhm.
Yeah, very
Mhm.
great work. Very wonderful. Well, we are pressing right up against that boundary of time. This has been such a gift and an honor to chat with you both today over this beautiful, beautiful book. I really do encourage everyone to take a moment and sit with this book and read it and
Mm.
incorporate it, because it has an extremely powerful effect. So I'm just so grateful you took the time to sit down and turn that 2020 pandemic into lemonade, so we could have this amazing tool. And is there anything you'd like to say to folks before we wrap up?
We like to hear from people.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
anytime you want to, if you get a hold of our email, Anne at
Yeah.
focusingresources.com, Barbara at focusingresources.com, we love to hear from people.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
Our
it's
team,
been just lovely. I personally have really enjoyed myself. So
it's been
it's been
wonderful.
And you've been a great interviewer,
wonderful, great.
Jamila.
Yeah.
Thank you
You-
so much for your presence.
Thank you for your presence.
Thank you for having something beautiful for us to dive into. I feel like I'm having a great start to my day with this conversation, as probably many of us feel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anne and Barbara. That was such a beautiful presentation. And Jamila, thank you for being the interviewer. It was so beautiful. Thank you all for your presence. We'll see you next time.